I knew something was wrong the second I turned onto my street. My stomach dropped as I saw the gaping hole where my house had been. Not damaged, not under construction, just gone. Nothing but a pile of rubble and dust. I slammed the brakes, jumped out of my truck, and stood there, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. My house, my home, where I had lived for the past 10 years with my wife, Whitney, was nothing but a flattened ruin. A few neighbors stood on their lawns, watching me with guilty, anxious expressions. And then, strutting toward me in her usual smug fashion, was Brenda Wilcox, president of the HOA. A middle-aged woman with the perpetual expression of someone smelling something foul. "Oh, Nathan. You're back early from your vacation," she said, clasping her hands together like she hadn't just destroyed my life. I turned to her, barely able to form words. "Where is my house?" Brenda gave a dismissive wave. "Oh, that old thing. Well, it was in violation of several HOA regulations. You failed to comply with multiple notices, and as per HOA guidelines, we took necessary measures." I blinked at her, my brain struggling to comprehend the sheer insanity of what she was saying. "You bulldozed my house," Brenda sighed dramatically. "Nathan, you didn't respond to our letters. We gave you ample warning." "That's because I was on vacation," I roared. "And what violations?" "What guidelines? My house was up to code," she pursed her lips. "Your grass was overgrown, your shutters weren't HOA approved, and frankly, your paint color was an eyesore." I took a deep breath, trying to keep from losing it completely. "You demolished my house over shutters and paint, without a court order, without proper notice." Brenda rolled her eyes. "It's all in the HOA handbook, Nathan. You should have read the fine print when you moved in." My hands clenched into fists. I had dealt with Brenda's ridiculous HOA nonsense for years: petty fines, absurd rules, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, she had the audacity to say, "Now, of course, you're responsible for the cleanup costs. We can discuss the fines later." I took a slow step toward her, my voice deadly calm. "You have no idea what you've just done, Brenda," she scoffed. "Oh, please, what are you going to do, sue us?" "The HOA has an airtight legal team." I let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, I'm not suing you, Brenda." I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I knew by heart. Whitney picked up on the first ring. "Hey, sweetheart," she said. "How was the trip?" I exhaled slowly, my rage barely contained. "Whitney, the HOA bulldozed our house." Silence. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, my wife said, "I'll handle it." Brenda was still smirking, completely oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. Because what Brenda didn't know, what no one in this HOA knew, was that my wife wasn't just some lawyer. She was the Attorney General, and Brenda Wilcox had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The moment I ended the call, I saw something flicker across Brenda's face, a small crack in her usual condescending demeanor. Maybe it was the way my tone had shifted, or maybe it was just the name Whitney that made something click in that empty skull of hers. She straightened, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, I hope you understand, Nathan, this wasn't personal. The HOA has a duty to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, and for the first time she seemed unsure of herself. A few of the neighbors had stepped closer, murmuring among themselves. Some of them looked downright horrified. Others, the ones who had been under Brenda's thumb for years, just looked nervous. Then, a sleek black car pulled up so fast it nearly skidded. The door flung open, and Whitney stepped out. She was still in her tailored work suit, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She wasn't the tallest woman, but she carried herself with the kind of presence that made people step aside without even realizing why. Brenda's face paled the moment she recognized her. Whitney's heels clicked against the pavement as she marched toward us, her eyes scanning the ruins of our home with an expression so controlled, it was terrifying. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but lethal. "Brenda." Brenda tried to recover, plastering on her usual fake politeness. "Mrs. Whitmore, what a surprise. Whitney didn't acknowledge the greeting. She turned her sharp gaze to me, eyes searching, assessing. Are you hurt? I shook my head. No. Just furious. She gave a small nod, then turned her full attention to Brenda. Explain, now. Brenda opened her mouth, but Whitney held up a hand. Carefully. Brenda swallowed. There were multiple violations. We followed protocol. Proper notice was given. Whitney reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. You mean these? She flipped through several documents. The notices you sent. She pulled one out and held it up. Dated last week, while my husband and I were out of town, and conveniently no signature of receipt. Brenda's lips pressed together. Whitney continued, her voice razor sharp. That alone is a major legal misstep, but let's not stop there. She pulled out another set of papers. No demolition permit filed with the city. No court order, no due process. Brenda shifted. The HOA has authority. Whitney cut her off with a single look. The HOA does not have authority to demolish private property without legal proceedings, Brenda. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. You committed a crime. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder. Brenda's fingers twitched. Whitney didn't let her finish. You and every board member who approved this are facing serious charges. Property destruction, fraud, illegal seizure of assets. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? Brenda's confident facade was crumbling fast. She glanced around as if expecting someone to jump in and defend her. No one did. Whitney pulled out her phone and made a call. Captain Reynolds. Yes, I need officers at my residence immediately. We have a case of unauthorized demolition and criminal misconduct by an HOA board. Brenda gasped. Wait. Whitney ignored her, giving our address and a few more details before hanging up. Then she turned back to Brenda, her expression unreadable. You thought you could get away with this, she said, almost like she was amused by the sheer stupidity of it. You thought you could bulldoze our home and just fine us for the cleanup. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, her usual arrogance nowhere to be found. Then the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Brenda took an instinctive step back. This doesn't have to be. Whitney's eyes flashed. No, Brenda. It does have to be. A few minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up. Officers stepped out, and as soon as they saw Whitney, they stiffened, not out of fear but respect. One of them, Captain Reynolds, approached. Ma'am, Whitney nodded. Captain, we have an illegal demolition here. HOA overreach, no permits, no due process. I want every board member involved in this detained for questioning. Brenda sputtered. You can't just… Actually, Reynolds said, folding his arms, she can. Another officer turned to me. Mr. Whitmore, do you want to press charges? I exhaled, feeling a deep, burning satisfaction. Oh, absolutely. Brenda's face turned ashen. Nathan, be reasonable. Whitney stepped between us, her expression cold. You bulldozed a sitting attorney general's house, Brenda. You think you understand the law, but you have no idea what's coming for you. Brenda tried to laugh, a weak, desperate sound. This is just a misunderstanding, but it was too late. The officers were already moving in, pulling out handcuffs. As Brenda was led away, the neighbors whispered amongst themselves. Some of them looked relieved. Others, the ones who had been too scared to speak up against the HOA before, now looked at Whitney with something close to awe. Reynolds turned to us. We'll get statements and make sure this is handled properly. Whitney nodded. Good, because this isn't just about us. It's about every homeowner they've strong-armed. I looked at my wife, my anger now mixed with pure admiration. Brenda had made one colossal mistake. She thought she was untouchable. Now, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. As the officers escorted Brenda toward the squad car, her protests grew louder, more frantic. Some of the other HOA board members had gathered near the sidewalk, whispering urgently among themselves. A few of them looked like they wanted to intervene, but none dared, especially as Whitney turned her attention toward them. I watched the board members shift uncomfortably as my wife's sharp gaze settled on them. They knew what was coming. Brenda might have been the ringleader, but she hadn't acted alone. One of the board members, a wiry man with thinning hair named Gerald Simmons, cleared his throat. He adjusted his tie as if trying to compose himself. Mrs. Whitmore, surely we can discuss this reasonably. There's no need for legal escalation. Whitney arched an eyebrow. You were on the board that approved this demolition, correct? Gerald hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Yes, but we were operating under the assumption that, Whitney cut him off with a measured tone, that you had authority beyond what the law allows. That you could demolish private property without due process. That you wouldn't be held accountable. Gerald swallowed hard. We were following Brenda's lead. She assured us everything was within our rights. Whitney tilted her head slightly. So you're claiming ignorance as your defense? Gerald shifted his weight, clearly realizing how poor his argument sounded. I folded my arms, stepping closer. You signed off on this. You didn't question it. Didn't think, hey, maybe we should check city regulations before bulldozing someone's home. Another board member, a woman named Linda Porter, wrung her hands. We were told the notices were sent and that you'd ignored them. We didn't know you were out of town. Whitney's expression didn't change. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility. You still acted outside the law. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Hale, stepped forward. Ma'am, would you like us to detain them as well? Gerald blanched. Wait, now let's not be hasty. Whitney considered them for a long moment before speaking. No, not yet. The board members let out relieved exhales. Whitney held up a hand. However, each of you will be required to provide a full written statement detailing your involvement. If I find discrepancies, if I discover that any of you were more complicit than you're claiming, I will ensure that you face the full legal consequences. Gerald nodded quickly. Of course, full transparency. Linda gave a nervous smile. We'll cooperate completely. Whitney's lips pressed together in a knowing expression, as if she saw right through them. She turned back to Captain Reynolds. I also want a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. If they were willing to go this far, I wouldn't be surprised if there were other violations. Reynolds nodded. We'll get started on that immediately. Brenda, still standing near the squad car, snapped. This is ridiculous. You're treating me like a criminal. Reynolds didn't even look at her as he responded. That's because you are one. Brenda's face twisted in fury, but she had no comeback. The officers finished securing the scene, while Whitney and I walked toward what remained of our home. Neighbors lingered nearby, some casting wary glances at the board members, others murmuring about what had just unfolded. A few looked genuinely horrified by the extent of the HOA's overreach. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who had always been friendly, stepped forward. Nathan, I had no idea they were going this far. I thought they were just issuing fines like usual. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Neither did I. If I had, I would have fought back sooner. Whitney surveyed the ruins with a calculating gaze. We'll rebuild. But first, we're going to dismantle this HOA from the inside out. Linda, still hovering nearby, paled at the statement. Wait, dismantle. Surely that's not necessary. Whitney turned to her smoothly. You and your colleagues just authorized the destruction of a legally owned home. You've overstepped in ways I doubt even you fully comprehend. Do you honestly think you'll be allowed to continue running this community? Gerald's face was slick with sweat. We can reform. Make changes. The HOA does good things too. Whitney's gaze didn't soften. That's not up to you anymore. Another officer approached her with a clipboard. Ma'am, we've started documenting everything. Do you want a full list of prior homeowner complaints against the HOA? Whitney nodded. Absolutely. I want to see every single one. Frank spoke up again, clearing his throat. If you're looking for stories, I've got plenty. They fined me for having my American flag on a pole instead of on my porch, said it interfered with the neighborhood's harmony. Linda winced. That was Brenda's rule. Whitney's expression was unreadable, and you enforced it. Frank crossed his arms. I've got a stack of letters and fines dating back years. If you're serious about taking them down, I'll hand them over. Whitney extended a hand. I'd appreciate that, Frank. He gave a firm nod before walking back to his house. I exhaled slowly, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. So what's the next step? Whitney glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. Legal proceedings will take time. But before that, we're going to rally the community. The HOA thrived on intimidation. We're going to shatter that hold, piece by piece. I looked at the remains of our home and then at the board members, who were now looking more like cornered prey than authority figures. For years, they had bullied homeowners, issued outrageous fines, and controlled the neighborhood through fear. But that ended now. Brenda had wielded power recklessly, thinking she was untouchable. Now she was facing criminal charges. And soon, the entire corrupt system she had built would come crashing down. Whitney stood amid the wreckage, her gaze sweeping over the debris with an intense, unreadable expression. The wind carried the scent of dust and shattered wood, and the quiet murmurs of the gathered neighbors filled the air. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The unchecked power of the HOA had finally reached its peak, and now it was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. Gerald and the remaining board members lingered awkwardly, their confidence completely eroded. The reality of what they had participated in was sinking in fast, and unlike Brenda, they weren't deluded enough to think they could talk their way out of it. They weren't handcuffed, not yet, but the threat loomed over them like a storm cloud. Whitney turned to a nearby officer and gestured toward the HOA's clubhouse, a sleek, overfunded building at the end of the street. It had always stood as a symbol of their control, a pristine monument to their self-importance. The HOA's records are kept there, she asked. The officer nodded. That's what we've been told. Financials, homeowner complaints, everything. Whitney flicked her wrist toward it. Secure it. No one from the board is to enter until the investigative team has gone through every document. Gerald's face tightened. That's unnecessary, don't you think? We're fully prepared to cooperate. Whitney's expression didn't change. If that were true, you wouldn't be trying to control the narrative. You'd be volunteering those documents yourself. Linda fidgeted beside him, looking like she wanted to speak but thought better of it. The reality was, none of them had any leverage left. The officers moved quickly, securing the clubhouse while the forensic team arrived. Several neighbors, emboldened by what had happened, began stepping forward with their own grievances. Frank wasn't the only one with a history of fines and dubious rule enforcement. As more stories were shared, the weight of the HOA's corruption became undeniable. A man in his 50s, dressed in a faded work shirt and jeans, gestured toward his property. They fined me for parking my truck in my own driveway. Said it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. I had to shell out hundreds just to fight them, and they still threatened further action. A woman beside him scoffed. They tried to make me tear up my garden, said the flowers weren't uniform enough. I refused, and suddenly, I was getting citations for ridiculous nonsense garbage cans not being pulled in fast enough, my porch light being too bright. It was harassment. More voices joined in, a chorus of frustrations that had been bottled up for years. The board members shrank under the scrutiny, all too aware that their tactics, once accepted as the norm, were now being laid bare for what they truly were: abuse of power. Whitney turned to Captain Reynolds. I want every single fine, notice, and complaint from the past 10 years examined. If they were using unlawful tactics to extract money from homeowners, that's fraud. Reynolds nodded. We'll start combing through everything. Linda finally found her voice, her hands trembling slightly. Brenda handled most of the decisions. We just followed her lead. Whitney's gaze locked onto her. That's not a defense. You may not have been the mastermind, but you were complicit. The question is, are you going to help clean up this mess, or are you going down with her? Linda hesitated, exchanging a glance with Gerald. There was no good answer. They had been part of the problem for too long to claim innocence, but they were also smart enough to know that sticking with Brenda now would be a losing battle. Finally, Linda exhaled sharply. "I'll cooperate. Full disclosure, I'll give you everything I know." Gerald shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Same here." Whitney didn't look impressed, but she accepted it with a curt nod. "Then you'll be providing sworn statements. If I find even a shred of dishonesty, I'll make sure you face the full weight of the law." They nodded quickly, knowing there was no room for argument. The neighborhood was fully alive now, with people stepping forward, officers moving in and out of the clubhouse, and forensic auditors beginning their work. Brenda, still restrained in the back of a squad car, had gone quiet, her earlier bravado completely drained. I moved to Whitney's side, lowering my voice. "What happens next?" She glanced at me, her expression softening for the first time since arriving. "Legally, they're in for a nightmare. Criminal charges, lawsuits, financial audits, it's going to take time, but they'll be held accountable." I exhaled, feeling some of the tension in my chest ease. "And us," she reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "We rebuild, and we make sure this never happens again." A sense of finality settled over the scene. The HOA had ruled through fear for years, but their reign was over. The community, once too scared to fight back, was finally standing together. And as I looked around at the people who had once been silent, now speaking up, I knew one thing for certain. Brenda's downfall wasn't just about justice for us. It was about taking back our home, our real home, from the people who had tried to control it. And this was just the beginning. As the officers secured the HOA clubhouse, Whitney wasted no time. She walked toward the forensic auditors who had just arrived, a group of professionals in suits carrying briefcases and laptops. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and introduced herself as Evelyn Carter, head of the investigative team. Whitney gave her a firm handshake, her expression unreadable. Without hesitation, she gestured toward the clubhouse. Evelyn nodded and signaled her team to move in. Documents, computers, and financial records would all be examined. If there was corruption in the HOA's finances, these people would find it. I stood back, watching as my wife maneuvered through this storm with precision. She always had this level of control, this ability to command a room without raising her voice. Brenda and her board had no idea who they had picked a fight with. The community members, now fully engaged, had gathered closer. Some were still in shock, others were angry, but most of them were watching Whitney like she was their last hope. They had spent years under the HOA's rule, forced to comply with arbitrary fines, ridiculous restrictions, and thinly veiled threats. Now they were witnessing the complete dismantling of that power. A man I recognized as Jacob, a retired firefighter who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, approached Whitney. He had the build of someone who had spent his life doing hard, physical work, but right now, he just looked exhausted. He told her about how the HOA had fined him for repainting his house, even though he had followed the color guidelines exactly. Then, when he fought back, they suddenly discovered that his fence was an inch too high and forced him to pay thousands to have it rebuilt. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying frustration that hadn't faded even after all this time. Whitney listened, her expression darkening slightly as he spoke. When he finished, she asked him if he could provide records of the fines. Jacob nodded, saying he kept everything. Other homeowners began stepping forward, each with a different story. A young couple revealed how they had been fined for putting up a small playset for their kids, only to later find out that Brenda's own grandkids had a nearly identical one in her backyard. An elderly woman named Margaret recounted how she had been threatened with legal action for having a bird feeder, under the claim that it attracted unwanted wildlife. The common thread was clear. The HOA had ruled through selective enforcement, targeting homeowners they knew wouldn't fight back while letting their own friends slide. Whitney turned toward Captain Reynolds, who had been overseeing the gathering. She instructed him to begin compiling formal complaints from the residents. Each one would be documented, cross-referenced with the HOA's records, and added to the growing case against Brenda and her board. Gerald and Linda, still standing nearby, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Their cooperation earlier had been self-serving, but now they were realizing that their role in this mess wasn't going to be overlooked. Linda cleared her throat and hesitantly stated that she had seen Brenda change records in the past. When pressed, she admitted that fines had been altered, complaints discarded, and payments misallocated. Evelyn, who had been listening closely, immediately instructed her team to focus on discrepancies in financial records. This was no longer just about illegal demolitions and harassment. This was about financial fraud on a massive scale. The officers escorting Brenda had been waiting for transport to arrive, but now they received an update over the radio. Additional charges were being filed based on the evidence unfolding in real time. Brenda had gone from an arrogant HOA president to a criminal facing serious legal consequences. The realization must have hit her, because she finally stopped shouting and instead slumped in the back of the squad car, staring blankly ahead. Whitney turned to me, her expression still sharp but with a flicker of something softer beneath it. She asked if I was okay. I told her I wasn't sure yet. Losing our home was still sinking in, but watching Brenda's empire collapse made it easier to handle. She nodded and then turned back to the auditors, making sure every legal avenue was being pursued. Jacob approached me again, this time with a determined look. He said that now that people were finally standing up, the HOA needed to be completely dismantled. No reforms, no new leadership, just gone. I agreed. Other residents echoed the sentiment. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they weren't willing to replace one corrupt system with another. Whitney looked thoughtful for a moment before addressing the gathered crowd. She explained that legal dissolution of an HOA required a formal vote by the community. Given the circumstances, a judge could expedite the process, but the homeowners needed to be involved. Margaret, the elderly woman with the bird feeder fines, stepped forward and declared that she would go door to door if necessary. She wasn't going to let another corrupt HOA take Brenda's place. The energy in the crowd shifted. People weren't just angry anymore, they were ready to act. Whitney instructed one of the officers to draft an official petition. Signatures would be collected, and once enough homeowners agreed, the HOA would be legally dissolved. Gerald, realizing that his time as a board member was officially over, muttered that he was leaving town. No one stopped him. Linda, on the other hand, stayed. She looked like she wanted to say something, but instead she just sighed and sat down on the curb, staring at the ground. The officers continued processing documents, while Whitney coordinated with the auditors. The evidence against Brenda and the HOA was growing by the minute. Then, Evelyn called Whitney over and handed her a document. Whitney read it, and her expression hardened. She turned to me and said that it was worse than she thought. The HOA hadn't just been issuing fines and illegally demolishing homes. They had been siphoning money from homeowners under the guise of maintenance fees and funneling it into personal accounts. Brenda wasn't just a tyrant, she was a thief. And now she was going to prison. Whitney scanned the document Evelyn had handed her, her expression tightening as she flipped through the pages. The forensic auditors had only just begun their deep dive into the HOA's records, and already they had uncovered what could only be described as outright embezzlement. Money collected under the pretense of neighborhood improvements had been funneled into personal accounts, Brenda's name appearing most frequently, but other board members weren't far behind. Evelyn pointed to a specific section, explaining in precise terms how the HOA had manipulated the books. The maintenance fees homeowners had been forced to pay each year were significantly higher than what was needed for actual upkeep. The excess funds had been rerouted through fake invoices, withdrawals labeled as administrative costs, and outright cash transfers to board members. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal fraud. Whitney's expression darkened further as she processed the scope of it all. This wasn't just about our house anymore. Brenda and her cronies had spent years systematically stealing from the very people they were supposed to represent. She turned to Captain Reynolds and instructed him to prepare additional charges. Brenda wasn't just facing property destruction and misconduct, she was looking at grand larceny, fraud, and conspiracy. Reynolds nodded and relayed the orders to his team. Officers moved swiftly, securing more evidence while Evelyn's auditors combed through the financials. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had fully mobilized. The outrage that had been simmering for years had finally boiled over. Margaret had already gathered a group of volunteers, and they were moving from house to house, collecting signatures to dissolve the HOA altogether. Jacob had taken it upon himself to organize a community meeting on the spot. People gathered in small circles, discussing what came next. Some were cautiously optimistic, while others were furious that they had been duped for so long. Linda lingered near the sidewalk, watching the unraveling of the HOA with a hollow look. She had agreed to cooperate, but it was clear she had underestimated just how deep the corruption ran. Gerald had already disappeared, unwilling to face the consequences. Whitney approached Linda and asked her how much she had known about the financial fraud. Linda hesitated before admitting that Brenda had always been secretive about the finances. The board had been given access only to selective reports, carefully curated to make it seem like everything was above board. Any questions were met with deflections or outright hostility. Whitney pressed further, asking if any of the other board members might have deeper knowledge. Linda hesitated again before naming one Paul Redding, the HOA's treasurer. Reynolds wasted no time. He sent officers to Paul's house, which was only a few streets over. Within minutes, they returned with Paul in tow, a short, balding man with darting eyes. When he saw Brenda in the squad car and the officers securing the clubhouse, his entire demeanor shifted. Paul wasn't an idiot. He could see which way the wind was blowing. With barely any prompting, he spilled everything. He admitted that Brenda had orchestrated the scheme, but that every board member had benefited. Paul himself had been receiving monthly stipends from the excess funds money he knew wasn't legitimate, but he had convinced himself it was just a perk of his position. When Whitney asked if he had records of the transactions, Paul nodded vigorously and said he had kept copies just in case. Evelyn's team took immediate custody of the files, their suspicions confirmed. The HOA's entire financial operation had been a sham, and now there was hard evidence to prove it. As the weight of everything sank in, Brenda finally broke her silence. From inside the squad car, she shouted that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had only ever done what was best for the community. No one believed her. The officers took Paul aside for further questioning while Linda sat on the curb, looking utterly drained. She knew she was in trouble, but at least she had cooperated. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's energy had shifted from anger to action. People weren't just reacting anymore, they were taking control. Margaret returned with the petition, now filled with hundreds of signatures. She handed it to Whitney, who reviewed it before passing it to Reynolds. With this, the HOA's fate was sealed. A judge would finalize the dissolution, but the decision had already been made by the people who lived here. The clubhouse, once a symbol of the HOA's authority, was now just another crime scene. Officers collected evidence, residents retrieved documents proving they had been wrongfully fined, and the forensic auditors continued their work. Whitney turned to me and asked if I was ready to leave. I glanced once more at the rubble that had been our home, our life. It still hurt, but knowing that Brenda and her corrupt empire were finished made it easier to bear. I nodded, and together we walked away. Behind us, the neighborhood had changed forever. The HOA was gone. The people had taken back their community. And Brenda Wilcox, the woman who had once ruled with an iron fist, was on her way to prison.